again. Welcome to the Relationship Restaurant, episode number 83. We are Poppy and Jeff Spencer. Delighted to have you with us. We are all about heart-healthy communication, and today we're going to be more about even body-healthy communication. Because sometimes when you feel stress or anxiety, it can manifest itself in the body, especially if you're having a challenging conversation in your relationship that you're in. Yeah, well, we have a very special expert guest today that will not only tell us what's going on, but give us a few strategies to manage it.
Yes. So I'm going to read this bio because it's amazing. We're so excited to have Heidi Hadley with us from the UK, but also living down under right now.
In Australia.
And Heidi is the founder of a company called Total Somatics, and she'll give you a little bit more about what that means. She's a certified clinical somatic educator, and she's also a somatic movement teacher in the work of Thomas Hanna. So you could probably Google him and find out who he is. He's a big deal. And then she's also a qualified Pilates instructor, which, by the way, is really hard for me to do. I feel like I have no core. Can't do it. But she gives her clients this great awareness of their bodies, their movement, the patterns, and educates them with a skill set so that they can perform like specific exercises for like just 20 minutes each day in the comfort of their own home. So she will give us some pointers later on what we can do to connect that mind and body. She's also trained in mainstream medicine as a medical technical officer in neurophysiology at the University Hospital, formerly the Queen Elizabeth in Birmingham in the UK. And she started her career in natural therapies in 2001, so almost 20 years ago, and has acquired many different techniques over the years to bring greater choice to the clients. And I really like that. I like the idea of choice. She ran clinics in England treating people with serious disabilities, and many of these clients suffered with like multiple sclerosis. So we're so excited to have her here. She, as a qualified teacher in adult education, Heidi has created many courses and transferred them into the online arena, which is perfect for our 2020 lifestyle that we've all begun to enjoy online. And she also is qualified as a baby and infant massage educator. And that was from the UK in 2008. And Heidi has taught many parents over the years how to practice effective massage techniques on their incredible, lovely, beautiful children. So welcome, Heidi.
Thank
you. We are so thrilled to have you here. And tell us a little bit, I mean, like right off the bat, and in case we've forgotten something in the bio, if you want to interject that, that's great. But what is somatics in simple terms? Because many people might not be familiar with the term.
Yeah, so somatics, it's a huge subject, but I always bring it back down to one nice, simple, but meaty statement. And that is that it's mindful movement to release chronically tight muscles. And so I always dissect that down because I ask people to think of the word mindfulness or mindful. And like we all know that mindfulness is the in word at the moment. But when we actually think about the deep meaning of mindfulness, it's where it's actually an internalized process. So it's where we feel and we sense within and start to monitor and self-regulate how we feel within. So it's not looking at other people and comparing, because we're all so unique. And up to today, we've had different life experiences, we've got different bone structures, we've got different mindsets and medical histories. We've been raised in
have aging bodies.
Well, I'd like to say probably just more wise bodies,
more miles on them.
But that's the thing, is that if you think about it, we've all come from different ways, haven't we, and different cultures and societies and belief systems. So who we are is made up from what we feel, what we sense, how mindset's here, and how that translates into our entire mind and body, which in somatics in the Greek is soma. So it's the whole being. So it's like a sensory organism. Everything that we take in, we perceive, we interpret it in the way that we've shaped the lens that we look at the world. And then from that, we respond or we react, as it were. So there's that mindful awareness. But because we bring movement into it, it's a way to kind of discharge and dissipate a lot of that stored energy and tension that people can hold. You can see the way that they hold themselves in their posture. And within your membership, Poppy and Jeff, we've talked, haven't we, in a bit more detail about the postures that people can show in different stress responses. So that's what's really nice, is being able to kind of break that down and look at it further. So we've got that mindful movement side of things, but somatics is all about educating people, empowering them, and skilling, putting skills into their life, really. Because if you were to roll over in bed in the middle of the night and your back was to twinge on you, instead of creating this story and catastrophizing in your head of, could it be this, could it be that, I can't do this now, I'm, in that sense of doom. If you've got that somatic education and that awareness, you can kind of lie there and think, wow, it's probably because of this has happened. So because I know that's probably what's triggered it, there's this particular somatic movement that I could do here to take that contraction and that tightness and that discomfort away. So that's basically what somatics is. It's an entire movement practice, but not just movement. Within total somatics, we go in further into looking at the mindset, mindfulness, and other lifestyle factors, because it's how we live our life on a daily basis. And we're constantly working on ourselves. We're all work in progress. But when we bring that mindfulness into our lifestyle, that's when we can start making huge shifts and changes.
So tell me about like stored energy. Do we have energy that's good energy and bad energy? I mean, I'm not sure how to qualify that, but is there a way to store healthy, helpful, productive, valuable energy? And then is there a way that we unwittingly store unproductive, unhealthy energy?
I'm sure we do plenty of that.
Yes.
And if you think about it, every cell in our body vibrates, doesn't it? So it's all energy. We're all energy, everything we do. And I'm sure you and your listeners will also know this, that, we're so intuitive as humans anyway, that when somebody comes into our presence, we can often feel and think, oh, you know what? I think they're a bit low today. You can feel that low energy, can't
sure.
you? And then other people come in and you're like, whoa.
Hey, hi, how are you?
The room comes alive.
I'll have a bit of that, thanks.
Yeah.
Literally, it's like, whoa. So you can see how someone's vibrational energy already can start to change things. So when we go into the world of somatics and we look at how energy is being used, we want to use that energy. We want to use that positive, vibrant, upbeat energy. But it's also having the energy that and the knowledge that we can control that, and take look after it, good management skills, as it were. Because if we continue to live in this high level of energy, that can be like that nervous anxiety, that nervous energy. It's like rolling on and firing up that cortisol levels. And as we know, the cortisol levels deep down are increasing inflammation in our body. That contributes towards autoimmune issues, and other problems can arise. But likewise, if we have a lot of low energy, if we're kind of repressing emotion all the time, or we're not discharging that very low energy field that we have, then it can create the repressed emotions. It can, of course, feel that you're very locked and tight in a body. And so either way, it's not that healthy, really. So with somatics, what we're wanting to do is use somatic movement. And there's a specific process we use called pandiculation. And it's a 3-step process that's to change the way that your brain talks to your muscles and basically your entire soma, so that we can do a bit of a software reset. And it will discharge the sort of negative energy, and it will start to bring your body back into a state of balance. So when you have that, you're able to move more freely because you're not living in that fight or flight stress response. So you're not.
I wanted to bring up, because one of the things we chatted with Heidi yesterday a little bit about this ahead of the call, and she mentioned this pandiculation, but the way you described it and the comparison you made
with our fur friends.
Was our furry friends, especially. Yeah. We have in our home 2 cats and a dog, and animals do this very easily, very
and is it
naturally.
Involuntarily, instinctively?
It is. And that's the thing, because we're vertebrate animals, little cats and dogs, any vertebrate animals, we've all got the same brainstem stress response. So in our brainstem, it's a part of our brain that's subconscious. So we don't think about what's happening in there. It just happens. So our heart rate, our breath rate, hormonal secretions, digestive function, and these stress responses that people can get. So in a stress response, people can exhibit either they go into like a fetal position and their tailbone tucks up and under and their ribs depressed, their shoulders roll forward, or other people in a stress response, their bottom will stick out. They'll have a sway back, very straight back, and their chest will stick out. And so that's the fleeing or fighting. And we see that in the animal kingdom, and we mentioned about the dogs, for instance. When a dog is anxious, what do? Their tailbone goes between their legs, doesn't it? So they go into that brainstem reflex response. You might see in other things like an ape, when they want to be very they're standing their ground, what do? They go into the other reflex. It's an instinctive response. But what happens with the animals is that they learn to regulate that stress response. And so they will discharge that negative energy. And very quickly through the process of pandiculation, they will create a reset between their brain and their muscles. And so what it will do is it will take them out of that fight or flight stress response back into a state of balance. And that's the difference, that through human life, and we were mentioning yesterday about how it often starts from when we go to school, let's say the age of 5, we're told to sit still, look straight ahead. We become more immobile, don't we, compared to when we were rolling around before school. And then even things like questioning thoughts, we sometimes get taught, and even like the teachers, their limiting beliefs and their belief systems, and this can start to shape a very immature brain,
underdeveloped brain.
Exactly. And until the age of 25, that brain's still growing and developing, isn't it? So because of that reason, very quickly we've got the fact that people can become quite immobile with their movement, but then also the mindset shifts could start to come in. So this is why when we look at the animal kingdom, they just listen, they work instinctively with their body, and they just move and pandiculate. But from about age of 5, or it could be before that, but it's often about that when little ones go into the world, the pandiculation kind of gets deconditioned out, really. And we start just living in this stress cycle. And so instead of discharging that negative energy and resetting our posture and letting the muscles soften and release after being in that fight or flight stress response, what then happens is you've got layering, haven't you? You've got one bit of stress, you never dissipate that. So then there's another bit of stress layers. And then before you know it, people get into like their late 30s and into their 40s. And things like chronic pain, like back pain or disc issues, the things that they used to bounce back from, they're not so resilient anymore. And it's because over the years, that pressure, that dial of stress has been going up and up and up. And it all happens subconsciously. And it's only when we get pain and the things that we used to use to deal with the pain and the discomfort are not shifting, that people start going, well, is this it? Am I doomed? Is this because I'm aging? And yet in somatics, Thomas Hanna, you mentioned at the beginning, he actually coined the expression, the myth of aging, because he said it is a myth. He said it's all about conditioning and habituation. And if you do something long enough and you behave in a certain way, your brain and your body will start to mold and mimic and create that. So, for instance, you think of the old man stoop, people would say it's from aging, but the children now are all on devices. And so they are changing through habit their posture at a very young age.
And
so it kind of throws.
They have tech neck.
You got it.
Yeah.
And it throws that myth of aging out, doesn't it, really? Because these are young ones, really. And you think when we were their age, we were maybe climbing trees or doing all sorts of things. So we were still moving.
We were outside all the time.
Yeah. And so they're becoming
even in winter, it didn't matter.
It is. And so they're already starting to become quite immobile, but then there's a lot of pressure on them as well. So you've got demands, you've got the technology, you've got cyberbullying, there's all sorts of things. So all this starts to just build up more and more, doesn't it, within their mindset, their emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual health. So can you see why somatics is a massive subject? But when we start looking at different areas, it's actually really important to consider it as a whole, really.
And I really liked when we talked earlier, you talked about our bodies are like this woven matrix.
Yeah.
And could you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So well, we were talking in relation to like fascia, so the with like the neuromyofascial web. So basically, at day 15 of conception, we're a
Still in utero.
Yeah, in utero. So it's
In
just day
utero.
15. Day 15 of conception. So we're just a collection of amazing cells. But what happens is that the matrix, this fascia appears, and it's designed to kind of collect those different groups of cells. And what happens is they create little pockets, and these little pockets start to grow into like a heart muscle, kidneys, the gut, all these sorts of things. So what happens is when we're born, we've got all these organs, but can you see where the soma, the whole being, comes into being? Because this is really what we see with the fascia, because from head to toe, we're just one huge matrix of fascia, and it's holding us together. And what's absolutely amazing about fascia is that it has its own nerve supply. So there's about 6 to 10 times more nerve receptors in fascia than there is in muscles. So again, as a sensory organism, as we perceive and we absorb everything around us, the fascia is listening. And so what we find is that when people get those real deep visceral gut pain, there's all those sorts of things happen, or there's all sorts of things. It depends on the individual, what they feel. But that's where that fascia is just starting to get quite rigid, and it just starts to get quite solid and tight. So when we move, we're not just moving with the muscles, and it's not just moving endorphins and getting the hormones and feeling better for the movement, but fascia is designed to slide and glide. So because it slides and glides, that's where you can see that we are supposed to be moving. That's why we should always be moving and gliding, whereas fascia is actually resistant to stretch. And that's why pandiculation is so powerful, because pandiculation is about teaching the muscle to contract, slowly lengthen and release, and then rest. So you let that integration, that rest, teaching your nervous system and giving it permission to say, stop. Because like everyone's on the go all the time like this. And then we repeat that over and over again. So when we do that lengthening, and it's not a stretch, but it's a lengthening, we're listening to where the end range is of that movement and the fascia, and it teaches them to let go and release. And so think of energetically the power, the movement, everything is starting to flow again. Because again, when we're stressed and we're anxious, and if we're either nervous energy or we're rock bottom, the fact is that there's a dysregulation of our energy, and we need to preserve our energy, protect our own energy when we're working with others or interacting with others, but also respectful of theirs. So it's like a two-way thing. So being empathetic, but also always taking care of our own energy, as it were.
Heidi, I was just thinking of something. Poppy and I have often said when you're having a challenging conversation of some sort, often one of the best things to do is just get up and move, go for a walk. And we're saying this because it just seems like a good thing to do. This kind of falls into this category, does it not? This movement, dissipation of energy, and it changes the dynamics of how you interact. So Absolutely. That's why this movement, often getting up and going for the walk, is such a healthy thing to do, to change the dynamic of not only the conversation where it's going, but how you're reacting to it.
Absolutely. And another thing to add to that, Jeff, is that there's this window that when you look at neurobiology, this window of capacity, or it's a window of tolerance. And we can all resonate with this at the moment, because around the world, we've seen how this window of tolerance and capacity has shifted dramatically. So if you can imagine, this is a little window here. Above here, you've got the people that work on that nervous energy, and they're like boom, 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 boom. And they're the ones that react and get really fiery at the drop of a hat. Mm-hmm. And then this end are the people that will get quite recluse, and they'll go quiet, and they'll be suppressing that emotion and hard to kind of express their feelings, and they'll shut down. So what happens is that with everything that's going on in the world, you've got this little window of capacity where people live. But what happens is, with their default behaviors from conditioning and upbringing, all sorts of things, if they get a lot of pressure, they'll either flick to that side of the window or that side of the window, depending on their default. But what's happening is with everything that's going on in the world, that window of tolerance, of capacity has shrunk. So very quickly, at the drop of a hat, people will flick off in either direction. So this is why, like in somatics, we were mentioning before about standing back with soft eyes and seeing the bigger picture. Because when you see the bigger picture, it stops us from reacting quite quickly, because it's instinctive. It's something that we all do. Nobody's perfect. As I said before, we're all work in progress. But the fact is, if we all understand that this tolerance has got smaller, this window of tolerance, if we can be the one to kind of step back and create that pause, as it were, then what it will start to do is it will change the dynamic. So instead of it being like a cat and dog existence, like you said, Jeff, what would happen is either side of that window, if people just go off for a walk on their own, or they do some somatic movements, if they're more of a person that kind of holds things in and they suppress things, maybe their way would be to bring in that mindful somatic movement, because it's a way to kind of open the floodgates, as it were, to release what they usually have been conditioned to holding down, and doing things such as what I teach, things like rib release, and to get the diaphragm to open up and get the belly to start moving freely. Because remember, we talked about the fascia, it's that deep visceral reaction, and we hold so much trauma and emotion in these areas that unless we start to open them up, we just continue to repress that. And it's unhealthy for us, and it's an unhealthy situation for a relationship, because you've got the other party thinking, well, I want to know how you're feeling, but you're just not opening up to me. But then the other person may be firing off, and you think, if you can just go for a walk or do something that's going to be a way to discharge, like we said before, discharge that energy, then when you come back together, that's when things can start to open up. Because if we allow for that window of capacity for us to just self-regulate, get back into that capacity, and that means probably leaving the room and shifting space for a bit. When you come back, then you're both in that window again. The reason why you fell in love, or you created that friendship, you get back to the common thread that kept you together in that relationship. So that's when you then work on the art of conversation, and just that two-way mindful conversation, as it were.
And I'm loving this window of tolerance. I don't know about you, Poppy. My mind's just spinning with this this concept, because Poppy and I created a tool, our emotional clock, and this almost, once again, just like many things, dovetails this idea of how when we don't communicate effectively and we tighten up and we get tense, the communication drops off, that window shrinks. And I think it's a great image. It's
a great visual.
It's a great visual, because that's what often causes these big blow-ups, because your window is just gone, and it takes nothing for you to hit that anger button and to get beyond that, to get to the point where you're able to communicate again. That's always the magical part, being able to get back to that and get past we call 6 o'clock, this that fight or flight movement, and getting to relief. And we could really put a lot of this into our coaching, Pops, of talking about movement. This is a great complement to it.
So yeah, and when we were talking about people in conflict in a situation like that, and so not every somatic response there's not like an umbrella for everybody. Everybody's different, right? So if a person, like, for instance, I think both of us are recovering conflict avoiders, right? And so I'm a people pleaser. I'm giving. I didn't used to create boundaries or assert myself, or I avoided conflict like crazy, right? And I was on that lower window, right? I would just not engage in the fight, because I knew I could never get myself heard in past relationships. And those relationships have now ended because when I did try and assert myself, it was no longer acceptable for those people in the relationship, because it was like, no, I liked you submissive and not just saying yes to everything. And so it's like, Well, when I wanted to become a little bit more empowered, that didn't work well. So those relationships pretty much fell apart.
Heidi, I wanted to bring up something we were talking about earlier. So often in these kind of relationships, Pop, speaking of, and I've had it too, and so many of our clients and members of our membership group we have, they are in very challenging relationships, often with narcissists. And one of the things that we've both experienced, and so many other people have experienced, is you try so hard to make things better and to help fill that reservoir that they don't seem to have, that you give away your energy. You're always trying so hard to help them that you don't realize you're just handing yours away in bucketfuls. And you were explaining there's that A, that's very true, but B, there's ways to try to get it back. And you even had somatic exercises you were speaking of.
So that when we've unconsciously or subconsciously depleted our own energies in the effort to give to other people because we care about them, how can we do that so that we don't have guilt and shame about taking that time for ourselves or doing these exercises or not falling into a habitual pattern that we ourselves have created?
Yeah. And that's the thing, because with the two of you, when you were just mentioning that, it is about preserving and taking care of our own energy.
Mm-hmm.
And what can happen in a very unhealthy relationship is that disconnect can happen. So remember, as a soma, we want everything to flow, everything's to flow all the time, but you get a disconnect. And what happens is that when you're in a survival state, or you're in a giving state because you're trying to appease that person, or you're trying to keep the peace, or you're walking on eggshells, and there's all these sorts of things that happen. What happens is you just live in a survival head space.
Yeah.
So it's, you're literally looking at how can you keep the peace, how can you preserve things and manage things. And what's happening during that time is, from the neck down, you're not even noticing all the sensory feedback. So, but maybe it's years later, it could be at the time, but people wonder why they get that recurring, say, shoulder pain, or they get this ongoing gut problem, or they've got irregular periods, or they have really painful periods. And there's all sorts of things, there's lots of different things that can happen, ongoing migraines. And you think, is it my periods? Is it this? Is it that? And you start thinking, and so everything is just a disconnect, because you're so focused up here. You've not really, and not everyone, but people don't always realize that this is heavily, your body is everything is a reflection of what's going on. So it's kind of winding it back. And as you said, Poppy, it's taking that time for self-care and nurturing, because usually as a giver, it's what can happen is it's almost like, it's like that person is like a leech. They see your confidence, they see everything about you, and they become a leech on you, and they suck the life out of you. And you can end up being like a shell of yourself. And yet in the process, they've built themselves up. They think they're wonderful, but it's only by extension from that person. It's not from their own self. So we need to take that time out to self-heal, basically. So there are lots of things that people can do. There are like mindful breath work. And I know I've shared things with Poppy and Jeff, so I'm not sure if you're ever, if people are interested in that, but there's like a mindful audio sequence. So
yes,
be able to kind of contact you and give their email address or whatever they do to get that. But that's just a way of, again, winding down the central nervous system to really lower that stress response. And to, first of all, when we take control of our breath rate and we slow the breathing and we notice our breathing and we notice all the subtle bits of feedback, which is in that awareness scan that I mentioned, what that starts to do is bring you back into your own soma, as it were. But then we were talking about, there are like a specific somatic embodiment technique, which is really nice. And I mention it here, but when you finish listening to this, then be worth just doing it in quiet on your own and really taking in that time. And it could take some time to actually start to feel those emotions and senses within, because there could be a huge disconnect. So that's why it's like a daily practice. But what it is if there's been like abandonment issues or attachment issues, and this could be from childhood, could be in later life, but sometimes we're taking things in, aren't we? We often attract the people in our lives that we've kind of been conditioned to over the years. So what you find is you just take that same thread, and unless we change the software up there and work on our own self-worth and esteem, we'll kind of just go into that same pattern or default behavior.
Right.
So with the somatic embodiment, if you're listening to this on the audio and you can't see the visual, I'd just like you to picture this in your head if you can. But what we're going to do is a few little parts. So we're going to reach around as if we're kind of hugging a tree, as it were. So we're going to reach around and hug that tree. And then as your hands come together, I'd like you to grasp and grip them as if you're holding on tightly to something. And then slowly just draw your hands into your heart. And then place one hand on top of the other, on top of your heart. And just close your eyes. You could do this whole practice closing your eyes and just sit there for that moment and just take that time. And then we could do that again. So we could reach around and just do a fair few movements in that way. And then you could just hold that there and just holding that there and holding and sensing and thinking what emotions come up. There are different ways. Some people might feel sadness. It may be like an anger or a frustration. And just holding that and thinking this area that you're holding on to from conception, this has been with you. There's that beat. It's been with you your whole life. And so we've got that. But then there's something else which is really powerful. And that is that if you're a person that either has felt neglected or there's been abandonment issues or you feel that you've been giving all the time, something that's quite powerful is that what you can do is cover your hands and cover your mouth. And you can either just say it quietly, and all you do is just say your name, and you just say your name quietly over and over again. And you close your eyes and you just sit with that feeling. And when you sit with that feeling, you can sometimes feel that there's that emotion, different things come up. So again, this is a practice to do specifically in that quiet time. Because
It's beautiful.
It's like someone's talking to you.
Yeah, and that's what it is, because sometimes, and that's why when you've got your hand over your mouth like that, it's actually really powerful, because how many times do we say our name or we make that recognition or that acknowledgement? And sometimes that could be the first step to actually creating those boundaries, those protections. And if there has been a fact that you may have felt, there are people that will do that and they'll cover. And I'll say to them, what do you feel? What do you notice? What comes to mind? And some people will sit there and they'll say things such as, it kind of takes me back to the playground when I'm calling out for people and they're not looking my way or not responding, or there's different feelings, different emotions. So can you see how when we work somatically and we start to work with all our mind and embody that and recognize that we're all work in progress. And as we've mentioned again, when you stand back and you look at not just yourself, but everyone else, we've all got a history. And I think that's where, especially now with that window of tolerance and capacity that's narrowed, if we personally in our own lifestyle and practice can allow that window to open a little bit more, it just makes our relationships with everybody easier. And it makes the relationship with ourselves better, because we're less of that perfectionism and driving and pushing to get things done because we think we've got to achieve something at a certain date. Whereas when we just realize that as a soma, how we nurture and care for ourselves is so important. And that really, it can take time. We're always going through that. And if you think of how we grew up and where we grew up and the countries that we grew up in, there's history there, isn't there? So we were talking before about intergenerational trauma. So in some countries, people experience like the Second World War and other wars. And so it could be that they're a result of the grandparents or the parents. And we're now through a generation that people can stand back, because again, is that standing back and seeing
Soft
things.
eyes.
Got it. And when we stand back, now we're starting to see that there's this pattern of trauma that's come through the generations. So we live in a great time where people have got skills that they can start to actually bring in to start to just shift things slightly. And I'd love to just mention this to you if it's okay, but there's this part of your brain called the reticular activating system. And I get really excited on a geeky level over this bit because
we can tell.
It doesn't take much. But basically the reticular activating system is basically that expression, what you focus on grows. So we've
Sure.
heard of the expression. So for instance, you know, when you're driving around and you've taken an interest in a specific car, for instance, and then all of a sudden you see that car everywhere you go.
Yep.
Have you ever
Yes,
seen
you
yeah.
do. Yes, you do.
Yeah, that's the reticular activating system. So basically, you've got so much sensory information that's coming in every second of the day. I mean, if we were to stop and think of all the noises around us, our brain would explode probably. But what happens is this filtering, this reticular activating system comes in and it filters what we're allowing to take in. So if we're looking at a new car, we're allowing all the information that's going to tell us about that car to make that decision. And then other things it does is it really focuses down on a situation such as, we haven't seen it for a while, but if we've been in a big group of people and then you hear your name mentioned the other side of the room and you're like, oh, hello, what's going on there?
Yeah, right.
And what you can do is you can really narrow down and focus, and you can sometimes pick up key words that person is saying, because the reticular activating system has silenced all the noise around you and focused directly on what's going on. So if we think of the principles of that, as a child, we grow up and our reticular activating system is being conditioned and molded by the school, by our culture, our society, our upbringing, all sorts of things. We're like sponges and we soak in people's coping mechanisms and just their manners and their behaviors. And so then as the years go on, unless we change that lens, we can switch that lens and make a softer lens, or we can just change the way that we view the world. That's when we can actually condition our reticular activating system to respond differently. So there is the capacity to shift and change. And in some cases, we may need additional support, like with a clinical psychologist, for instance, if there's some huge shifts on a biological level within our brain. But with other things, it's a daily, if we just have a daily practice, or we have like affirmations and we live with intention, that our intention is just to be kind, nurturing to ourselves, to others, try and not, like we were talking about the 4 agreements, not one of the, don't take it personally. So it's very easy to say all this academically, but if we can develop it on a daily basis, we can change that reticular activating system. So we look back at our former self and think, wow, haven't I, and you give yourself credit, haven't I really done well? And I continue to do well.
Yeah.
Got it. And that's what a soma does. It exists in time. So it shifts and it changes because it's how we basically use that sensory perception and how we can change the lens that we look through.
You know, Heidi, one of the things that came into my mind, I know some people that have hearing aids. And one of the things they speak of as a frustration is it kind of gets in the way of that process. It picks up all the noise and it doesn't let your brain focus in on what it wants to focus in on. It takes all that in, and you can't differentiate. It's all just noise. And it's fascinating. It's that you just described what the frustration people who have hearing aids often speak of. They don't like it because it just amplifies everything. You can't hone in on something.
Absolutely. It does. And I was just thinking with thinking about how it's all about that conditioning, isn't it? I was thinking, it's always great having someone who's so inspirational, who you think they let me get this right. If I got this right way around, they walk the talk. That's right. They walk the talk. That's right. And they walk the talk. And I know we were chatting before we came on to record about Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor. And I just think if we can take a lesson from him, wow, he's been through a lot. And can I just mention one of his quotes that he brings?
Yes, please.
It really comes in here. And that is that Viktor Frankl says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And it's in that response lies our growth and our freedom. And I just think that's really powerful, isn't it? Because you think if we just allow that pause to happen, within that pause, we can make or break relationships. We can do an awful lot within that. But also, if we allow that pause within for our somatic embodiment, we can stop ourselves living like in a roller coaster or on a hamster's wheel, where we're just kind of living on that nervous energy. Which then creates that shorter fuse and it narrows that window of capacity again. Right. So I just think it's a really powerful one, because if we do that in somatics, what we also know is that if we stand back and we make that pause, we start to use the prefrontal cortex. And so that's our rational thinking. It's our focus, awareness, concentration, decision making instead of reactiveness. But also it's the emotional intelligence. And so the more that we can create that pause and that mindful approach to life, and the MRI scans have shown that we thicken the prefrontal cortex and we live a more conscious, more everything that we do is much more mindful. So our conversations and what we listen to, what we read, our association, because it's all these sorts of things can either build us up or tear us down, basically.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things Jeff and I were talking about, we periodically will have little brainstorming sessions and goal planning for our business. And one of the things that I wanted to do is to state our goals of just being more mindful, the pause that you recommended, and then to consciously choose the words we say so that we don't default back into patterns. And I know I recently was challenged with this, so just making a comment in a social media group, and somebody was offended by something that I said, even though I thought it was really kind. It was like, my my heart goes out to you or something. But the person took it personally as I was pitying them, and I wasn't. I was just trying to say, yeah, I get you, but I should have chosen my words better. And it was just really interesting how we can be just taking that pause and being a little bit more conscious and aware of the exact words we write and how we speak.
And I think one of the things Poppy and I said is, this is back to this window of tolerance. There's so many pressures of late in our world that have come upon us that we can't control a whole lot of, that have shrunk this incredibly. And I know I found myself, leaping off and saying things far too aggressively and quickly because this toleration has been taken away by all the external stuff that's been going on, and it's hard to separate that out and not let it take over.
And it manifests with other people differently, right? We've all experienced trauma this entire year of 2020. The whole world has experienced some level of trauma, right? Yeah. And grief, and how some people get more angry, some people get more depressed, some people, they manifest it differently. So when we're communicating things that we might have said a year ago to someone as a teasing, as something that's lovingly said, is now taken personally. And so everybody is, I think a great number of our population is responding more from a fear-based response because of all the external fears that we are confronted with day by day. I mean, we have personally taken a news fast for the last couple of weeks, and it's been great.
Yeah. And I'd agree with that, because the other thing, I'm sure you may agree with this, because what's happening is that people are becoming, and it's great because we're using technology to speak from other sides of the world. So technology is wonderful in its place. But what's happening with technology is it's starting to replace conversation. Right. So like when you mentioned before about that social media post, what's happening is that people, on the other end, that's why people put all these emojis on, to make sure that people get the right context.
Yeah, I had an emoji on there. Yeah. It didn't work though.
That's right. And what happens though is that, and we can see it, and all the experts are saying this now, especially with the younger generation, they're going, why are they feeling that they're so unwell mentally? Their mental health is being affected. And a lot of it is coming down to the fact that they've lost the art of conversation, the mindful conversation where you listen, you absorb, and then you respond. And what's happening is that they're just on their phones. And only a couple of days ago, my husband and I were out having lunch, and there were these two lovely girls on the next table, but they would just have their heads down in complete silence on the phones to each other. Now, they could have been communicating with each other on the phone for all I know. But the fact is, there was just zero conversation for probably about 25 minutes. There's just nothing. And you think there's all that emotion and those feelings locked in. And as social creatures, we've felt it when we've been isolated and in quarantine, as it were. But as social creatures, when we see a face and when we can read their body language and we hear the tonality of their voice and the warmth and everything, that's what makes us as a tribe. That's what makes us grow as people. And so really, that's where it's bringing that connection back in that community, because that's where it's more than ever before. As a Soma, we need that. This is where we need that flow of energy back and forth. But we also need that time to be able to release and open and feel vulnerable to a trusted person, that we can talk to them and know that they're going to be confidential with our discussions. But when we do that, it just makes things so much more, much easier, really. So it's kind of like you say, it's almost like having a digital detox. And I know it's the in thing to say digital detox, but it's actually really important, because the neuroscientists are showing that children's brains are being pruned and trimmed, and everything from up to those early childhood years, they're getting conditioned and pruned. So the more that they do something, and it could be just looking at screens a lot of the time, they're watching more of that, and they're missing the body language, the non-verbal communication, the mouth. We think how much, when we've got a mask on, how much we realize we lip read. It's all these things. This is what makes us feel that energy, and as I say, part of a tribe. That's what it is when we go back to basics, really.
I know. I get a super thrill when I'm talking to someone with a mask on, and I can actually see that, oh my gosh, their eyes are smiling. I think they're really smiling underneath the mask. And it's like, yay, I found somebody.
Yeah, you mentioned this communication thing too, Heidi. I've noticed this. My mother is very elderly, almost 98. And when I talk to her on the phone, her hearing's not good and her mental capacity is diminished to some degree. But it's really hard to talk to her on the phone. And but we talked to her in person. This is exactly what you said. She can see my face, she can see my lips, and the communication.
Even with a mustache.
Yeah, the communication just changes dramatically in a face-to-face fashion. She's able to just take it all in, and we can now have a very good conversation. But over the phone, it's really
like
really challenging. Yeah, it just
like,
doesn't work. We just got to keep it very simple, very basic, very short and sweet, because it's hard to communicate without that the total experience. We totally get that.
Absolutely. And right.
What was one of the things we were just I used to teach one of the psychology courses I taught at the university was at the college level was psychology of social interaction.
Wow.
And this was like 10 years ago, when the students would say, oh, I know exactly what was going on in this text message. Now, this is 10 years ago, before we all became pretty tech savvy. And they said, for instance, my roommate is angry at me. I said, well, how did you know? And they said, because they wrote in all caps, or they took too long to respond to my text. And I said, well, what if they were in a class, or what if they were talking to a professor, and they go, no, that wouldn't be it. So, and then that would totally affect their moods. Right. And so we had a challenge, a 24-hour challenge. It was mostly optional, but highly recommended, to go without their devices for 24 hours. I literally will tell you exactly what happened. I had 3 students that had to go to the counseling center because their anxiety level was so high. And they could still use their laptops for schoolwork, but no communication with friends. They had to have face-to-face. And so one student said her biggest challenge was she was meeting some friends for dinner at a restaurant. And as she stood outside, she didn't text them to say, I'm here. And she said, I didn't know what to do. And it was like, Could you just open the
Yeah,
door
why
and
don't you
look
look
and
in the
see if
restaurant
they
and
were
see if
there?
they-
And that never occurred to her. So we are so dependent on these
Yeah.
devices for that it limits our ability to be able to expand and go, what are some other possibilities here? Let's use our critical thinking. You know, what if I just poke my head in the door and see if they were there yet? And so, and no, none of the other students in the class came up with that.
Yeah.
I was just dumbfounded. It was like, it was incredible to me.
And I think that's when we were talking earlier about it's having principles in life, isn't it? So we're talking about somatic principles, that mindfulness principles, and it's bringing those principles of everything as well. Because and this is really interesting, because when people, they'll go, you know, in other situations, how should I do this? What should I do? And instead of like telling them, we want to educate them, don't we? So when we do that, then that's when that creative thinking comes in, and they bring their little quirky bits with them, don't they, of their
Sure.
personalities. That's what you want to see. And so it's kind of, they're so used to now everyone's having things in front of them that they don't have to think about it. I mean, going back, like, what was it, 25 years ago now, my medical physics lecturer, when I was training in neurophysiology, I did medical physics and physiological measurement. So basically it was all about the sort of diagnostics of the machines. It was all physics and maths and things. And so we're going back years ago, before computers and the phones became what they did.
Sure.
And my physics lecturer said to me then, he said, you know, there's less people going into physics and maths, but specifically physics, than ever before. And he said, these computer screens that are coming in, and, you know, bless him, that was years ago, not like now. He said, it stops people having abstract thinking. He said, because physics there's lots of things you have to think about, and it's thinking outside the box, as it were. He said, but now everything's presented to them on the screen. It stops their imagination.
Mhm.
Yes.
And he said, people are just not reading. And he said, when they read, their imagination flows. So he said, and he was concerned like 25 years ago about this. And he said, it's just sucking the life out of our future scientists. And
Yes.
that, you know, there are scientists, brilliant scientists around the world, but it makes you wonder how many more we'd have if we just were able to kind of step back from those computers. And even gifted children, you hear of gifted children, but at some point there are like things that happen in their life, and then it can also cause other issues. So what we want to do is let all children, gifted or whatever, let them explore and play and learn to talk. Because again, when you've got a gifted child, they can be so focused on one thing that they lose the art of conversation, or they lose that having a global view of the world, or playing and conversing. Do you know what I mean? Because it's all narrowed down to one area. So it's really fascinating, but standing back again, as we say, soft eyes, and looking at everything globally, really, that's what it's all about. Yeah.
We are, and our time is just coming to an end here, but we're so thrilled to have you here. I would just have you go back and just clarify a little bit more about pendiculation and our furry friends, and something that they do, so that people can get a vision in their head of like, oh, okay.
How can I do this?
Yeah, sure. So basically, with pendiculation, am I able to do a little share of a slide?
Yes, of course.
Is that okay?
Oh, yeah.
Let me just see if we can do that. Because when we think of pendiculation...
Oh, wait. I don't want to do that. No. Never mind. Hold on.
Share screen. A little up arrow.
Share screen. Okay, sorry.
Multiple.
There we go. Okay.
That's all right. So let me just bring this up. Let's see if we can just bring this up here. And I'm just going to...
So if you're listening to audio only, I
We'll
think Heidi will
tell us what you're looking at.
Let me stop share. Let me just bring this up. So what I want to do is show you a picture of animals in the animal kingdom. So this is, let's just bring this up. Here we go. And I'm just going to scroll down to here. So what we've got here on the slide is a number of pictures of animals that we're seeing pandiculating. So for many, many years, our little fur babies have basically been demonstrating pandiculation to us, and we don't realize at times. So when we pandiculate, if we consider, for instance, on two of the images, we've got a dog and a cat. And if you can visualize this, if you're listening to it, have you ever seen when their bottom sticks up in the air and their little claws are out in front, and they're sometimes yawning, which again, a yawn is a pandiculation. But when they're in that position, people think that they're stretching. But in actual fact, in that stage, what they're doing is contracting their little back muscles. And then once they've contracted them, then what they do is they reverse that position and they start to lengthen them. So they might go into that little camel humpy pose of their back. And then when they've done that, they go, and release. And they either settle down and have a little snooze, or they go off and explore. And so what it is, it's a reset of an area in their brain that's called the sensory motor cortex. So it's the area of our brain that we sense and feel and we move. So this area controls all the muscles within our body. So
is it a stress release too? Is it when they've had some anxiety or stress that they do this?
Yeah, so it's a sensory motor reset. So throughout their day, they'll do it. And it's a way to self-regulate. So specifically, like we mentioned earlier, if they're in a very anxious stress response, then they're definitely instinctively going to do it straight afterwards to create that state of balance.
Yes.
But what they'll do is, even if they've just been chasing around a toy or something in the garden or a mouse or whatever, when they come back in, before they go down to have a little sleep, they'll do a pandiculation just to reset and let the muscles soften and come back to neutral again. Because when they're running around, they've got, the muscles are contracting and they're kind of firing up different actions. So this is, again, as a reset. And so, like we were talking about technology a moment ago, if you think, for instance, of your computers, we're always with computers doing software updates, aren't we? But how often do we actually do a software update on our brain to our
Yes. I love this software updates.
So it's a software update. So that's basically what we're seeing is those little animals are teaching us day by day. So just to break down, so you can just see those three parts there, we'd be basically looking at the contraction, a slow release, and then complete rest. So the contraction wakes up your brain and gets your brain online again. So it's like jump starting your brain. And then that specific area that we're contracting, so say it's my bicep, we're contracting that area of the brain to say, listen, I want to retrain your brain and teach you how to release these muscles. And then the second phase, we slowly lengthen and release and glide and slide the fascia and the muscles there to the end of that natural range. And then we go, because there's always something left in the tank. We're always used to racing around. So the third phase is giving permission to allow you just to stop and let your nervous system feel what it's like to fully relax. And next time you see your cat and dog do it, notice that that's what they do themselves, isn't it? If you watch them, they'll just like go, and they'll go into a blob on the floor or whatever they do. So they let that complete relaxation and rest be just as important as stage 1 and stage 2. So
I think that's so important to stress that, again, the somatic movement is not stretching, like no pain, no gain. That is not part of what this is all about. You should not extend or lengthen your arm if that's what you're doing to a point of pain. It's just till you feel that, and then you slowly bring it back. And the slow movement, I think, is what you've really highlighted for us.
And it is, and it is making it slow, because it's about that nurturing again. Do you remember we were saying we've all come from different walks of life, and sometimes the way that we actually talk to ourselves in the head, we wouldn't talk to anyone else like that, would we? So, and you think to yourself, and so how do we live our life? Are we always like 100 miles an hour, or can we tone that down and slow it down? Because you can still be productive with half the energy that people kick out, that nervous energy. And at the end, you still have that time to kind of rest and relax instead of feeling completely burnt out. So somatics is all about working smarter, not harder, basically. So if we start accessing the software and we start doing those daily resets like we do on a phone and on a computer, if we can update our software on the computer when we need to, think how much more our soma needs that on a daily basis with what we encounter.
Well, Heidi, I know many of the folks listening will probably go like, wow, I want to learn more about this. So I know you have online classes and information. How do they find you? How do they find more about you?
Oh, bless you. Thank you. Well, again, I'll mention, but I'll also just bring up a little screen share again, if this is okay with you.
Sure. And then say it as well.
Yeah, sure. So let me just bring down to a little slide down here. So I have a podcast, and a podcast that you can find on most podcast channels. So Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon, all those, or Apple, all of those, should I say. And the podcast is called Somatic Movement and Mindset. And within that also, I talk about brain health, brain science, pain science, all sorts of things, but I also bring in experts as well. So there's other experts on there that I interview, and we get a deeper view of life generally and how we can bring that somatic lifestyle to the fore. But I've also got a website, and the website is totalsomatics.com. So that's total, and somatics is SOMATICS.com. So totalsomatics.com is my membership. So I open the doors just a few times a year. And within that, we break down the concept of somatic movement, mindset, mindfulness, lifestyle factors, and then again, bring in lots of different experts from around the world to bring in their richness and their gems that can help to really widen people's perspective of the whole world and what we can do to take care of ourselves from the inside out. So we glow and we're better.
I'm definitely joining Heidi's membership when she opens her doors again at the end of January 2021. I think there's something, even though I was familiar with somatics before, there's so much more to absorb and learn. And so I would highly recommend that to anybody. I mean, I think you're a fabulous teacher, trainer, mentor. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
On the Relationship Restaurant.
And again, thanks for being a part of the.
And if you want to get Heidi's little gift that she has, we'll put it up on the podcast site where you could just shoot us your email, and then we'll send you her mindful audio. It's really lovely. I mean, it is truly a reset. So thank you so much.
Thank you for being on the Relationship Restaurant. Until next time, we're Poppy and Jeff. See ya.